ever since I got my Wii U a few months ago and got that modded, I've really started to see that I have more of an interest in Nintendo consoles than I thought. In fact, I've been playing the DS and the 3DS more than I used to as well. Not so much my Xbox and things of that nature. I really became invested in Nintendo consoles and started to discover how much fun they can be, which is why I went out and actually purchased a used Nintendo Switch for $200, that everything except the dock. And I think that if you can find one for $200 without the dock, that's a pretty good deal, because you're paying the same amount that you'd pay for a Switch Lite, but you have the opportunity to purchase a dock in the future if you want to. And Best Buy does sell new docks for $40. Granted, they're not genuine Nintendo ones, but they're still reputable ones that people really seem to like. So for another $40, hey, you could have yourself really the full package. But today we're going to talk about how to mod a Nintendo Switch. And I found this community of modders to be very confusing because people are trying to pursue a lot of different objectives. There are people who want to set up, there's really 3 different types of custom firmware on the system. So you have all those variables. Then you got people who want to set up Android on the system, people who want to set up Linux on the system like you'd have on a typical computer. There's people trying to do all sorts of different things on the Nintendo Switch. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to talk about how I set up Atmosphere, which is one of the 3 operating systems that people use for custom firmware, as well as how I got it to run NSP files. NSP files are basically backup games. They're homebrew games, homebrew applications, you name it. It's just an installable file that works on the Nintendo Switch. You may also see as you read into this, if you're thinking about doing this, that there are XCI files. Those are basically just game card dumps. Somebody took their game card, they dumped the game card files onto their Switch. Now they have an XCI file as opposed to an NSP file. XCI files is a little bit harder to work with because they're basically an emulated game card. So as far as I understand, you can only have one of them in place at a time because it shows up as the game card, as though that game card is plugged in. The NSP files install, so it's like a digital game where you can have all sorts of them on your home menu, so much more flexibility there. So if you're looking at purchasing Nintendo Switch, you want to mod it, like I said, $200 on eBay without a dock I think is the deal to look for, and you will definitely see that the more you look. Now, you need a few things. You need the Switch to have a low serial number. I'll have a link down in the description to a website where you can find out about if the Switch is going to be compatible or not. If the Switch you're looking at does not have a serial number listed, or if you message them and they don't get back to you about what the serial number is, don't buy it, don't take the chance, and definitely don't walk into a store today and think that you can buy a Switch that is moddable. The Switch is moddable from a hardware perspective, so there's a glitch in the early models that people take advantage of in order to run the mod. Obviously that was fixed physically on the newer models, so it can't be exploited in that way. Also because of that, the firmware that the system is on is irrelevant as of right now. So right now 9.0.1 is the current Nintendo Switch firmware, and if you have an old enough system, it's moddable even on the current firmware. So you need a low serial number Switch. You need an RCM jig. This is a small piece of plastic, costs about $4 or $5. It is made to slide down the right Joy-Con rail on the system, and you use it in order to get the system modded. Important that you purchase this. It's very cheap. Don't try and follow a video online where it tells you to use a paper clip. It's just too risky that it's going to end up breaking your system. And for the $4 or $5 that a real proper one costs, definitely worth picking one up. Now, the other thing you'll need is a micro SD card. I highly recommend a 128 gigabyte. Do not purchase the Nintendo Switch branded ones. Just purchase any SanDisk one that's 128 gigabytes. They typically go for about $20 on eBay, and I'll have a link to an eBay seller that has one for $20 as well. So you get $20 there, $5 there, so you're looking at about an extra $25. And you'll also need a USB-C cable, so if you don't have a phone that uses a USB-C, or if for some reason you don't have a USB-C cable right now, maybe you're an Apple user, you'll have to buy a USB-C cable as well, because that'll plug into the Nintendo Switch and then plug into your computer. So you got maybe another $5 there. So 25 to 30 bucks beyond the cost of the Switch. So what's going to cost for you to get this modded? So I'm going to give a simple explanation of how this works, and then I'm going to have a video link down in the description that's going to show in more detail what I followed, and then we'll go into the other parts as far as installing NSPs, and I'll have another more detailed video for that as well. So in order to get Atmosphere set up, the custom firmware on a Nintendo Switch, there's a few different files you need to copy over to the SD card. But first, you're going to want to put that 128 gigabyte micro SD card into your computer, format it as exFAT, eject it, put it into your Nintendo Switch. If it's never been placed in there before, it will ask you to update the micro SD card somehow. Just run the update, put the card back into your computer, and now copy over the files that you need for Atmosphere and the other different things that you're going to be setting up on it that is mentioned in the video in the description. Once you have those files copied over to the micro SD card, you need to put the micro SD card back into the Switch and then boot it into recovery mode. This is done using that RCM jig that I talked about, that small, cheap $4 or $5 piece of plastic. You're going to slide it down the right Joy-Con rail, press it into place, hold the volume up button, and hold the power button, all three of these at the same time for about 3 seconds. Once that's complete, you'll take the RCM jig out, just slide it up a little bit, plug the USB-C cable into the bottom of the Switch and into your computer while having a program open that's going to be able to push a payload to the Switch. And again, the video I'll have linked in the description will show this in more detail, but basically there are a few different payloads you can push to the Switch, and they all try to achieve different things. And that's like what I mentioned, people are trying to do so many different things with the Switches that it's very confusing to get information on what exactly you're trying to do. So I would highly recommend you use the Fuse payload, because that's the one that's going to give you much better compatibility with things like backup games, homebrew applications, things like that. I found this to be the one that gives you the best compatibility. Now, with the Atmosphere custom firmware, they do not include SIG patches. SIG patches are basically a sort of little patch that lets you play backup games that you maybe did not initially purchase. So the SIG patches are not included with Atmosphere. You need to get the SIG patches yourself. I'm not going to have a link down in the description to find those, but I'm sure you can probably locate them yourself on Google. These are not game files. It's simply a small group of patch files that allow you to play said games. So with the SIG files in there, with the system booted into RCM mode, you've sent the payload, it boots back up, and you're in custom firmware. Now, this whole process of getting into custom firmware has to be repeated every time you turn the system on. So obviously, the best thing to do would be to avoid turning the system off, which isn't actually that difficult on the Switch. If you just tap the power button every time you want to turn it off, you're really just putting it into sleep mode. The custom firmware will be there when you turn it back on. But it's if you start holding down the power button and you press the power off button, now you've completely turned it off and you've lost any hope of accessing your custom firmware without having to resend the payload from a computer, which on a portable system is a bit of a hassle. So I highly recommend you just keep it in sleep mode. Now, some of these homebrew applications can be copied directly over to the micro SD card, as they will hopefully show in the tutorial I have linked in the description. When it comes to installing tinfoil or gold leaf, those are NSP installers. Now, there's other homebrew applications I would recommend you check out, one of which is Checkpoint. Checkpoint is a program that's also available on the 3DS that lets you back up and modify save games locally. You don't have to upload them to a cloud or anything like that. You're able to actually keep the save data backed up on an SD card and modify it in a few different ways depending on the game. So a great option for you to check out. But if you set up an NSP installer, people typically go between tinfoil and gold leaf. I recommend gold leaf. If you set up gold leaf, you want to install an NSP, the ones you copied over to your micro SD card, it's as easy as just navigating through the file explorer in gold leaf, selecting the NSP that you want, installing it, checking that it works after it gets installed and appears on your home menu, and then deleting it from your SD card. Otherwise, you have a copy of the NSP, and then you have a copy of the installed files, and now the game is twice the size, so you don't want to do that. Now, the important thing to note about these games, if you're playing backup games, is you will want to find the updates online. You will not be able to download the updates just directly from Nintendo. It's very likely that your system will get banned if you do that. So I would not recommend that. In fact, I would recommend that you avoid any contact with Nintendo if you're on a modded system, just because it's fairly likely that you're going to get banned if you have, a Wi-Fi connection while playing backup games, things like that. Very likely. So how you can avoid this is you can set up a DNS server. They call it 90 DNS. It actually doesn't have a 90 in the number as far as I remember, but I'll have a link in the description as far as how to set up the 90 DNS. It's basically just a little bit of an additional Wi-Fi setting that you want to set up that will enable the system to block all contact with Nintendo. So then if it would prompt you to update a game, it actually wouldn't be able to. So if you want to get the game updates, your best bet is to find the updates online. Typically the same place you're getting your backup games from probably also has the updates. And the updates are just NSP files too, so it's fairly easy to install the updates. You just don't want to install the updates directly from Nintendo. It's also important to keep in mind that modded systems cannot or should not try to play online because you likely will get banned. And once you do get banned, you're not able to play online anymore. Now, in my opinion, and some people would debate this, if you've not updated your Switch in a while, I would highly recommend you actually update it to 9.0.1, which is the current firmware, before you mod it. Some people would argue that it's better to be on a low firmware. I would argue it's better to be on a high firmware because any games that come out here in the future are obviously going to require a higher firmware. So if you're stuck on a low firmware, you're only going to be able to play, for the most part, older games, and that's probably not what you want to do. So if you guys have any questions about modding the Switch, I am no expert by any means, but either myself or the comment sections of some of these tutorials that I linked will hopefully be able to help you. It isn't quite as complicated, hopefully, as it seems if you have the goal in mind that I did, which is I just want to install NSP files. I just want to install those. And I was able to do it, but it took shifting through a lot of online content that was pointing me in a bunch of different directions. Again, because there's 3 different custom firmwares. There's 3 different ways people can do a lot of things, but I think that Atmosphere is by far the most popular. So thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.